This video is brought to you by the Battle Zoo Bestiary, a new book featuring 100 award-winning monsters and the monster part system that allows players to harvest resources from their fallen foes and craft into custom gear. The Battle Zoo Bestiary is now available at battlezoo.com. Hello and welcome to Snares in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Before I get started, I do want to mention that the content in this video builds upon the information shared in my previous videos about traps, hazards, stealth, and crafting. So you may want to go view those videos before you continue here. Links to all of those topics may be found in the description. Snares are simple, one-use traps that characters can use to hinder or harm their prey. They're usually thought of as traps one might use when hunting animals in the wild, and therefore are often employed by rangers. So although snares are a type of trap and have the trap trait, they do function a little bit different than other hazards, which can cause some confusion, so let's walk through how snares work. Mechanically speaking, snares are single-use consumable items and therefore share some similarities with other consumables like alchemical elixirs, but there are a few differences as well. Unlike other consumables that can be carried, snares must be used immediately after they are crafted. It's not uncommon for people to assume that they can craft the snare first, carry it around like any other piece of gear until it's needed, and then find a good place to set it up. Or they think that they can create it and then hand the snare off to a friend to go set it up. But that's not how it works. In Pathfinder, the character must craft the snare in the square where it will be set, and it cannot be moved from that square. Essentially, crafting the snare and setting the snare are the same thing in Pathfinder. Crafting a snare works much the same way as crafting anything else and has many of the same requirements. To craft a snare, a character must be an experience level equal to or higher than the snare's item level. The character must have a formula for the snare. They must have appropriate tools, in this case they need a snare kit, and they must supply an amount of gold equal to the snare's listed price, as well as any other special materials that might be listed in the snare's description. Provided the character meets all of these requirements, they can spend 1 minute building the snare, at the end of which they must roll a crafting skill check against a DC set by the GM. In most cases, this DC will be a standard level-based DC per the table on page 503 of the core rules, and further adjusted by rarity and other circumstances. On a success, the snare is created. On a failure, the snare is not created, but the character doesn't lose any of the money or other resources they dedicated to setting up the trap. And on a critical failure, not only do they not set up the trap, but they also lose 10% of all of the resources they had invested. Snares can also be crafted for a reduced price, but requires at least 4 days of downtime labor. This works exactly the same way as crafting normal items, so I'm not going to cover those rules here and will instead direct you to my other videos on crafting, which again are linked in the description. Snares are designed so that they are hidden and hard to spot until they're triggered. Detecting a snare works in much the same way as spotting any other hazard, except you will not find a stealth DC listed in the stat block of a snare the same way you might find them listed for typical traps. Instead, all snares use the crafting DC of the person who created the snare as the stealth DC for that snare. And the minimum perception proficiency required to spot the snare will be 1 step lower than the crafting proficiency level of the crafter. So for example, if a ranger has a crafting skill bonus of plus 17 and a master level proficiency in crafting, then any snare they set will have a stealth DC of 27, and this also means that only creatures with at least expert proficiency in perception will have any chance of spotting it. If a creature does spot a snare before triggering it, they may attempt to disable it. Again, this works much the same way as disabling a typical trap. The person wishing to disable the snare will need to use the Disable a Device action. This costs 2 actions and will call for a thievery skill check to be rolled against the crafting DC of the person who placed the snare. And just like with detecting snares, the minimum thievery proficiency required to disarm a snare will be 1 step lower than the crafting proficiency level of the person who created the snare. Also note that the person who created the snare can automatically disable it with 1 interact action and no skill check. And because completed snares can never be moved, if a person succeeds in disabling a snare, they can't just pick up the snare and add it to their inventory. They might pick up the raw materials that were used in creating the snare and then rebuild the same snare someplace else, but would still need a formula for the snare, a snare kit, and a successful crafting skill check in order to do so. Unless otherwise stated in its description, all snares are triggered immediately when a creature of small or larger size enters the square. So this means that creatures that are size tiny or smaller will not set off the snare, so no worries about a rabbit or a mouse accidentally setting off a trap that was designed for enemies at least as tall as a goblin. Now when a creature that is at least small size enters the square, any effects listed in that snare's description take effect immediately and the snare is destroyed. Note that the rules say enter, so by raw it doesn't matter what means of locomotion the creature is using. Flying into a space will trigger the snare just as easily as walking into that space. But that said, GMs are encouraged to make other rulings as they believe make sense for the type of snare and the creature that is triggering it. So those are the general rules surrounding snares. There are also a few feats that a ranger can take to enhance the way snares work. Snare Specialist adds options to your formula book and allows you to prepare snares as part of daily preparations. Quick snares and lightning snares allow you to build snares faster, and powerful snares can increase the DC that victims need to pass with their saves. And also the Snare Crafter archetype can further enhance the snare crafting abilities of any character. Before we close, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of my patrons. These videos would not be possible without their continued generosity and support. If you would like to support this channel and help it grow, the easiest way to do that is by subscribing and clicking the bell icon so you get notified when new videos release. And I can always be reached through Twitter and Facebook too. Thanks for watching, take care, and happy gaming!